and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Gregor Schubert, an esteemed economist from UCLA Anderson School of Management, as our distinguished guest for today's podcast episode. Professor Gregor's research spans housing finance, urban economics, real estate, labor economics, and corporate finance, with a recent focus on the impact of urban migration networks on housing markets. Professor Schubert's research explores house pricing growth, variations during boom and bust cycles, linking them to migration patterns between US metros. He argues that rising housing costs push workers to more affordable areas, increasing demand and pricing there, even without direct economic shocks. His analysis shows that housing market shifts are more pronounced in well-connected metros, explaining regional price differences during economic cycles. Professor Schubert brings a diverse background to his work, having served as a strategy consultant across banking, financial services, industrial and consumer goods, and healthcare. With a strong foundation in economics, he also explored his creative side by minoring the theater at Princeton. His views he views teaching as a form of performance, aiming to engage students in understanding housing markets through the lens of personal choices and economic dynamics. Dr. Gregors earned his PhD in business economics from Harvard University and MS in economics and finance from Université Prout Fabra and AB in economics from Princeton University, achieving the highest academic distinction in his major. In this episode, Professor Gregor will share insights from his research topic, how generative AI led by ChatGPT is transforming finance and corporate decision making. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Gregor Schubert to the podcast. Professor Gregor, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
It's an honor to be here, and I love talking about this.
Thank you. Professor, how has the rapid rise of generative AI since ChatGPT's release in 2022 influenced the finance industry?
I mean that's a very broad question, but I think the broad answer is that I think lots of companies are right now trying to figure out how to adapt a lot of these new tools to what they're doing, right? And so what we're seeing is that there's a rapid rise in companies in asset management and in investment banking and so on, using a lot of these tools. And they're using them in very different contexts. So for asset managers, a lot of their tasks involve equity research, reviewing earnings calls, reviewing financial documents in order to figure out what companies to invest in. And for those tasks, a lot of the new natural language processing capabilities that come with generative AI are really helpful for analyzing these documents and more quickly drawing insights about what to invest in from documents. So for instance, I've heard of one asset management firm that an endowment actually at a university where instead of manually downloading earnings calls, reviewing them for whether or not they say something relevant, and then sort of filing them away, they just have a pipeline now where a generative AI tool reviews the earnings calls, highlights the most important points for the investment priorities of the asset manager, and sort of saves them that entire workflow. And at the same time, there's a lot of coding related tasks, of course, in large banks these days, and a lot of those coding related tasks and anything related to analytical tasks is going to be much more efficient and productive as a result of these tools.
What makes financial occupations particularly exposed to the productivity effects of generative AI?
So financial occupations, as I just mentioned, tend to be heavy on analytical usage, right? So a lot of bank occupations, for instance, are white collar jobs that involve sitting in front of a computer, typing some text, responding to emails, like just interacting in ways that require sort of text-based interactions or analyzing data. And it turns out that these new generative AI tools and also more traditional machine learning tools that recently have gotten a lot better are particularly good at doing those kinds of tasks. So one thing that we find in our research is that the potential to make particular tasks more productive or automate them using these new generative AI tools is much larger in white collar jobs. And so a lot of finance professions are white collar jobs and therefore are amenable to this. so in general, a lot of finance occupations do actually have a pretty high exposure to finding some use for these new tools. The important distinction is that this is not the same across the board across all finance occupations. So in many occupations, it's not just analytical skill, but also social skill that you need in order to succeed in a job. So, for instance, for financial managers or portfolio managers who are interacting with wealth management clients, financial advisors, and so on, there's a lot of social skill and interpersonal skills that are required in order to succeed in this. And in those jobs, some of the tasks might be automated by generative AI tools, but some of the tasks, especially the ones that require social interactions, are still going to remain a core part of what they're doing as a job. And so for those particular occupations, we would think that they're probably less likely to be fully automated away or replaced by these kinds of tools. They're more likely to get a productivity boost because suddenly the tasks that they were doing beforehand that weren't essential to their job, but they still took up a lot of their daily time, like reporting on what they were doing, writing up reports, providing lower information level responses via email to clients. Those things can now be taken over by these tools. And the higher value parts of having a human touch, the like understanding your client, really interacting with them and figuring out what they want, those parts remain for them, and they can now spend more of their remaining time on those tasks. So I think there's a lot of heterogeneity across different occupations within finance, where some of them are just going to see a productivity boost and might, as a result, have lower employment because you need fewer of them to get the same amount of tasks done. Whereas others, where their core tasks are not really impacted by these technologies, but they just get a little bit of a productivity boost from doing some of their auxiliary tasks, those occupations are more likely to stick around and might actually become more valuable to the company because suddenly they have more time to focus on their core tasks.
Professor Gregor, could you share insights from recent research on how generative AI affects firm value?
Yeah, I do have this is actually from some of my own research. So I have a paper that is joint work with Andrea Eisfeld, also at UCLA, Ben Zhang at USC, and Buddy Tosca, who works in the private sector. We have a paper on trying to measure how much stocks responded to this productivity potential of generative AI. So if your company has a lot of possibilities for using these tools in order to make itself more productive, how much does that impact stock market values? We do this in two steps. We first measure which companies actually are more exposed to these tools. And so what we do there is we look at the tasks that are done in each company. So there are experts out there, occupational experts that figure out what tasks are normally involved in different occupations. And for each of those tasks, we figure out, is that task something that you can make more productive using generative AI? And then we aggregate that up into company level exposures using their occupational employment structure. And so we use LinkedIn data on what kinds of jobs are employed by that company to see what the overall share of tasks is likely at that company that you can make more productive. And then we find that that the companies that have the most productivity potential from generative AI actually see a large bump in their stock market valuations right after ChatGPT is released. So it looks like the stock market is revaluing these companies in the light of these productivity improvements that they're seeing on the horizon. And we see that those impacts are actually rather large. So if you have about a standard deviation higher exposure to generative AI, so you have more productivity potential, we find around a 44 basis points per day higher return to those companies right after ChatGPT is released. So overall, their stock prices end up going up by 2 to 4% or so in the 10 days right after ChatGPT is released. And so that's a pretty large revaluation for some of these companies, just in the light of markets evaluating that these technologies seem to be particularly helpful for particular firms.
What are some key ways AI tools are transforming financial analysis and forecasting?
So there are a number of different ways in which financial tools matter here. So that AI tools matter for financial analysis. So I think the most important ones are probably uh, analysis of documents. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of equity analysts and financial forecasters uh, need to take in a lot of data on a daily basis based on press releases or other firm communications that are coming out. So sometimes firms put out just press releases or their news reports about them. Sometimes it's annual statements. All of that flow of text data normally needs to be processed by some analyst to figure out what is interesting about it. And so I think the key uses there are that AI tools can make that process a lot more efficient and faster by parsing large amounts of text, where large language models are very good at extracting key details from those texts and slotting them, for instance, into a structured database. And thereby, and that can be done in seconds rather than in hours that would take a human normally for this task. And so being able to do that in seconds means both that financial markets can incorporate information faster, but also that you save a lot of time in this process of financial analysis and forecasting. And then you can build a lot more sophisticated analytical tools on top of that faster data extraction. I think so the second part of where this becomes relevant is that a lot more, I'd say, like classical machine learning tools and neural networks and some of the more advanced AI tools can also then be used to analyze this data. So you can extract the data more easily, but also you can now build analytical applications on top of it. So for one of these things might be that you can now use the text that you extracted to generate sentiment indicators for markets that might matter for instance, interpreting the kind of language that someone is using in their earnings call might give you an interesting hint for how they're really feeling about their business. And that kind of sentiment analysis can now be done using these tools because they're very good at interpreting how particular words are used in text. You can also throw it into just a machine learning model and then use this data to try to predict what, for instance, company earnings are going to be. And so if we have more of this data that we can extract from the text that comes out of companies, we can also build better models.
How do you see generative AI influencing investment strategies and portfolio management?
Um, so I think it's a good question. I think that goes back a bit to what I was saying about asset management earlier. So you can, if you can better understand what a lot of companies are doing, and you have, in some sense, more capacity to analyze multiple companies, you can probably more easily identify companies that fit a particular investment thesis, right? So a lot of asset management firms are, for instance, trying to fulfill a particular mandate of, for instance, investing in environmentally friendly companies. Figuring out what companies have those characteristics takes a lot of time if you're having to sift through tens of thousands of companies. Suddenly, if you can do this automatically, you can find out much more easily which 300 companies are actually the ones that might fit your thesis, and thereby it might be much easier for you to implement more detailed investment mandates. So it's easier for you to say, okay, we want companies that are environmentally friendly, but also in this particular industry, and also do not use, I don't know, pesticides or whatever it is that is included in your mandate in some ways. And so better research tools make it easier to do more sophisticated portfolio investments in that case. The other aspect of portfolio management is probably that it makes it easier to interact with your clients. So, like, if your clients have badly articulated views of what exactly they want from their investments, you can suddenly use large language models both in client services to try to figure out what exactly, for instance, retail clients actually want from their investments. What are they aiming for? And try to channel that into portfolio recommendations. So you can get a lot more of this currently very bespoke and very expensive luxury advising process, and maybe automated using chatbots. And you, at the same time, you can also, for more sophisticated clients, interpret strategies better, right? It is oftentimes what a client really needs is for someone to write a report that says, look, we've invested in these companies. You have these interests in terms of your personal investments. How do our actual investment strategies map onto your particular needs? If as a fund, you have 3,000 investors, you cannot write an individualized report for each of them that tells them how this particular fund maps onto their particular preferences. But if you have a tireless analyst in the form of ChatGPT who can basically work 24/7 to write these reports and can write them very quickly with very little human effort involved, you can suddenly have all these customized investment insights and customized portfolio optimizations that help individuals understand how a particular portfolio serves their needs. And so I think there's going to be a lot more customization, a lot more personalized explanations of particular investment opportunities, and in some sense, a sense in some sense, a lot more of the portfolio management industry might look like the customized, bespoke investment advice that currently only the richest individuals are getting is suddenly available to a lot of people because even though the highly sophisticated financial advisor is not available to talk to you, the chatbot that gets you 90% there is available.
What are some specific AI-powered innovations in financial research methods?
So that's a broad question, and I could go on about this for hours. So I have a review paper on this called Generative AI in Finance now that is going to come out in the annual review of financial economics. And there, my co-author Andrea and I try to sort of figure out where the potential lies for applying some of these methods in research, and also where some of the pitfalls are. Right. So I think the one of the key issues is that a lot of these tools have not really only 2 years old, right? So we got ChatGPT around November 2022. And so people have only had 2.5 years to really figure out how these tools work. And oftentimes, even in the research labs working on these, the exact characteristics of how these chatbots work and what they're good at is not that well understood yet. And so for people to then take those tools and apply them in their own research setting, you need to take a bit of a leap of faith that whatever characteristics you think this tool has and what it does for you is actually something that can be replicated and is reliable in terms of your tasks. And so I think a lot of researchers are still struggling with trying to figure out when do these tools work, when do they not work, what characteristics do they have, and can we rely on those? So I was just at a conference where one of the things that people were talking about a lot is that if you ask these tools, for instance, to label particular sample items, right? So as I mentioned earlier, people in industry want to understand earnings calls. The same is true for researchers. We oftentimes have large data sets of earnings calls. We're trying to figure out, okay, I have 10,000 earnings calls. Which of these earnings calls talk about a particular event or talk about cryptocurrencies or whatever it is? And we're trying to find some systematic patterns there. If I have a large language model label all of those texts, I need to be able to trust it that it does that correctly, that all the labels are at least 99% correct, and so I can then do more analysis based on that. And we can talk about this more in a second, but I think that's where some of the risks and also some of the potential lies, that you can suddenly scale a lot of these data analysis tasks to 20,000 earnings calls or documents or whatever it is that you're analyzing that previously would have required an army of research assistants to work day and night for you for months in order to get this kind of stuff done. And now anyone can do it. Suddenly you have basically unlimited analytical tools at your disposal. And so that's a big potential for researchers to suddenly tackle much larger data sets. But it also means that we need to hope that these tools actually do what it says on the label in some sense, and we don't have as much of an existing literature to rely on that has tested and sort of kicked the tires on figuring out what it is that these tools actually do. But yeah, so I think it's large scale analysis of text where I think there's a lot of potential. There is using some of the more sophisticated embedding techniques. So embeddings is our way to convert text into vector representation. So you have a numerical representation of the content of a particular text, and then doing analyses based on those numerical representations is something that is relatively recent and has a lot of potential because you can suddenly do quantitative analysis on things that were previously just word counts or sort of less quantitatively sophisticated measures. And then I think there's a lot of potential for researchers to use these tools for simulating behavior. So, for instance, oftentimes we want to run surveys, and surveys are really expensive to run. And one thing that would be nice to do would be if you could test out your survey on some sort of simulated respondents. If you could just find 3,000 virtual people who can take your survey, and you can find out whether or not your questions work, whether or not they're giving you answers that weren't what you expected because maybe you didn't phrase the question right, maybe it was ambiguous what you were asking for, or they're interpreting the question in a way that you didn't see beforehand, but that's actually very valuable to you, and maybe you want to lean into that and add some additional questions. So it would be nice if you had some sort of trial setting where you could do that. And currently we don't have that, but with large language models, you can kind of treat them like a simulated survey respondent, right? So there's a way that you can treat them and say, look, dear large language model or ChatGPT or whatever you're using, pretend that you're a 30-year-old living in San Francisco. I don't know, you're Hispanic and you have a degree in political science. Like, here are some questions about your personal finances, for instance. And of course, it's not a real person, but the chatbot has a decent ability to pretend to be a real person, give you answers that at least mimic to some degree what you might get if you actually fielded the survey. And so it gives us some ability to very cheaply get rapid feedback on research. And then, of course, people just use these tools just for text generation as well, right? So when I'm writing a paper now, one of the essential steps in my workflow is that every time I finish a section, I will hand it to a large language model and say, I've just written the section of the paper. Do you have any feedback? Are there any sentences that are unclear? Can I make this more concise? Do you have particular wording advice? Is it too wordy, or can you make this more concise? And so I'll get sort of writing advice if I had a personal copy editor on call in some sense for all of my tasks. And I think that both leads to higher quality research output. People can suddenly deliver papers that are basically flawless in terms of both writing style and grammar and so on, and typos. But also it makes the research process a lot faster because the parts that are not essential, like writing up the paper at the end, or applying for grants, things like that, can be made much faster and much more efficient, and then sort of gives you more time back to focus on the important parts of research.
Professor Gregor, are there any risks or biases in AI-driven financial decision making that researchers should be cautious about?
Yeah, I think there are some risks. I've already highlighted some of them, which said that these tools don't always do what we think they do. So one thing that I found as I review papers for journals or for conferences, and I see other people using these tools, is that there is a tendency sometimes to want to personify or humanize what these chatbots are doing. And so the idea is that somehow the chatbot can intuit what you want from them, because if they were a research assistant, they would also be able to intuit it, right? And so people will give instructions that are often incomplete and imprecise to some of these chatbots. And so I think there's a lot of work that actually needs to go into crafting a good prompt in order to get a good response. So just to give an example, if you're for instance, if you want to evaluate whether or not a earnings call, and let me stick with earnings calls because I mentioned those before. If an earnings call where the CEO talks back and forth with the analysts, if you want to know whether or not the CEO is someone who cares about, let's say, sustainability, which is oftentimes a buzzword in this context, you can't just say, here's some text. Does the CEO talk about sustainability? Because sustainability could mean a lot of things. Like, what does sustainability mean? And so if you want, for a research context, if you want a precise answer and what you mean is environmental sustainability, and you mean by environmental sustainability, oh, like do they mention, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions or climate change or whatever it is, you should say that in the prompt. You need to tell the model what it is that you're asking. It's not going to read your mind and say, oh, if he says sustainability, he probably means environmental sustainability, and he probably means these subtopics. No, like the chatbot has no, it doesn't know your feelings, and so if you don't tell it what you want, it will just make something up. It will think, oh, he says sustainability, he probably means sustainability of profits, and then we'll talk about something and might answer a very different question from the one that you thought you asked. And so in some sense this is not new. This is the exact same thing that you would do with a human research assistant. You would have to give them precise instructions. What is it that you need to do? Here's what you do in these edge cases. Here's exactly what the goal is of this exercise. And then they might come back and say, oh, I didn't understand that. Can you clarify that? And the chatbot's not going to come back and ask for clarification. So you need to actually almost put more effort into thinking about your task and your task design than you would if you were talking to a human. And oftentimes people seem to think that because these tools work magically and they have some sort of black box feel to them, that they can also just magically know what question you're asking. And so that's not the case. You need to be precise about prompting. And I think that's where a lot of the people go wrong in this case, where they ask questions that a human research system couldn't answer reliably, and we don't even know what we're getting back, and so we get an answer back and we don't know what to do with it because we don't know what question we asked, and so yeah, I think at the end of the day, the thing that's hopeful for me in terms of my job security as a researcher is that I don't think these tools obviate the need for researchers to put a lot of effort into thinking about research designs and what the questions are that we're asking, and how to actually interpret the output that we're getting back. And at the end of the day, it's more of a collaboration between researcher and these tools. There's no sense in which they can just do research on their own. And so I think it's very helpful to both put a lot of effort into designing prompts well, and then also having an idea of when you're getting something back, is this the answer that you expected? So there should always be some human validation to say, I did some of the tasks myself. I pretended I was the chatbot doing the task. Here's what I wrote down as the correct answer in my mind. Does the chatbot come back with the same answer? And if it doesn't come back with the same answer, what is going on here? Can I refine my research task in some way that does come back with the right answer? Right? There should always be some sort of ground truth validation data set where you can compare, is what the chatbot produced actually something good, and then iterate on making whatever process you're using better at actually hitting the human benchmark here before you scaling that to 10,000 iterations. Yeah.
Professor, how can academia and industry collaborate to maximize the benefit of generative AI in finance?
Um, I wish I knew the sort of clear answer to that. So I think I think this is an exciting time because in many ways, industry applications are ahead of academia in some of these areas, right? A lot of these models come out of course, technology labs like OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on. And so they actually know more about their models oftentimes than we do. And in some sense, it's that even computer scientists who work in academia are not necessarily the ones leading these developments. Um, but I think there's a lot of value add that researchers can give in terms of the questions we can ask, as I said. So oftentimes these labs have amazing data access. They really understand what their model does, but they don't know necessarily how to connect that to broader societal impacts or like questions of policy and so on. And so I think where researchers come in is by being able to design and motivate interesting questions and interesting problems to solve with these tools, and then having people industry assist in figuring out how the tools can be used to answer those questions. So I think that collaboration in terms of asking good questions and then executing on that, where industry can collaborate with academia, I think that's where I see a lot of potential. I think there's also just a broader sense in which academics oftentimes have an ability to think very hard about learning and question asking, which in some sense is what chatbot's all about, right? It's all about you asking a question, you're getting some knowledge back. That sort of sounds like the learning process that happens in universities sometimes. And I think people who work in teaching or in pedagogy more generally probably have something to say about how to design tools that can convey knowledge easily and can interact with people in terms of acquiring knowledge. And so I think there can also be some expertise here in terms of learning theory that can transfer from academia to industry actually in designing these chatbots.
Professor, my last two questions. The first is, how can finance professionals integrate generative AI into their workflows effectively?
So I can, because this is so rapidly evolving, I actually get lots of interest. This is one of the questions I tend to ask my colleagues whenever I meet new people. I tend to ask, hey, do you use AI and how do you use it in your workflow? Because I'm always curious what they're doing. And so this is something where I can give a personal example of how I use it. But there's probably no generic advice that applies to everyone because it depends a lot on how you're working in some ways. So for me, when I do theory, for instance, so when I try to theorize a new model, and that traditionally involves a lot of sort of pencil and paper solving of a mathematical equation, previously there was a lot of double and triple checking of results involved, right? You might have made a small algebra mistake somewhere and that completely like flipped the sign on your results. And if you don't catch that, that would be very embarrassing. And so you really want to make sure that you're doing your math correctly. And that's a very expensive process in terms of research time, because oftentimes you might need a talented grad student or another colleague to invest a lot of time to check your math. And they would have to spend hours going through it and figuring out what you're doing. Now, my workflow is actually that I will pencil and paper solve something. I will type it up, or I will just like type up the idea for it and ask O1 Pro, which is the most math capable model that OpenAI has on the market. I will ask it to do the same derivation. It will say, here's a problem, here's the setup, go solve it. And then I wait 3 minutes and I see what answer it came up with. And if the answer it came up with is exactly the one I came up with, there's a good chance that I got this right. It's very reassuring that in some sense this decent grad student research assistant that O1 Pro as a model represents came up with the same answer. And then I can continue working rather than having to spend another like 5 hours double and triple checking that this first step is right. And so that actually makes the process much faster. And you can also use it for exploration in that process by if you get stuck somewhere, for instance, saying to the model, look, here's mathematically where I am. I don't know how to solve this. Can you give me some like 2 or 3 ideas for how I might be able to solve it? Oftentimes the model does not actually figure out how to solve it. Its mathematical abilities are more at the level of a like entry-level grad student rather than a researcher. But it can give you ideas, right? It can very quickly generate wrong approaches, and sometimes you get some insight from that. So I think there's a lot of like creative spark that can come from just seeing a reasonably smart model like try out a bunch of things very quickly. And then in the rest of my research process, as I mentioned earlier, I use it for writing a lot. So I'll have papers where I draft a particular section. Then I put it into a model and I get feedback from it. It's like I ask it, okay, like I want this to be like nice and readable and concise. Give me some pointers, like which paragraphs need work. And it will say, oh, like in the second paragraph, you're saying something that you already said earlier that's redundant, make that shorter. Or take a you can use simpler words here. You can restructure the sentence, right? So it gives me good writing advice, and that really helps. Excuse me. And then I also use it in coding and data analysis. So another part of my job is analyzing data. So I have large data sets I need to clean, and then I produce graphs, regressions, whatever it is based on those. And a lot of that coding part is done in Stata or Python or some other programming language. And previously, if you got stuck on a particular problem and you had to, for instance, I don't know, I need to filter a particular column for whether it contains a particular word, it would take me a while to go and figure out, okay, what is the right package to use in Python in order to do this? How to actually use that package? What's the right syntax here? And then try to type it up. I'd get some error back. Why did I get this error? Let me troubleshoot this, Google the error. Now this process is basically, I say what kind of solution I want. The model generates it in like 3 seconds. It generates Python code that does it. I try that out, and like most of the time it works on first try. Sometimes there's another error, but then I can put the error back in and it can troubleshoot its own error. And so that whole process of trying to write code for data analysis goes from being a 30-minute exercise to being a 5-minute exercise. And so that saves a lot of time and productivity. And it also enables me to do things that I previously just wouldn't even have attempted, because I would have said, look, I don't have time to learn this entirely new aspect of the programming language. I'm just not going to try. And now I feel like I'm empowered to do more things in some ways. And so it's both I can do the things that I previously did faster because of all these different parts of my workflow that are suddenly automated, but also I feel more ambitious in terms of the kinds of things I'm trying to tackle.
Professor, in what ways do you see AI shaping the role of financial professionals in the next decade?
That's a great forecasting question. I don't know if I know the right answer to that. I think there's I think the I think a lot of these things that I mentioned are going to intensify. It takes a while for industry and professions to change and actually adopt new technologies. And some companies are always ahead of the pack in this, and some companies are lagging behind. And so partially it will just be that the practices I mentioned in terms of using these tools to analyze data, using them to code within companies, using them for customer interactions. Part of the evolution will just be that will spread from just being the practice of some industry leaders to being something that everyone does across the board. There are packages for it. There are like off the shelf tools that do this for you. And so your company doesn't have to have particularly strong innovation capabilities. You can just pay for a tool that does all these things for you and it has the generative AI on the back end rather than you having to innovate yourself on that. So I think it's partially just that what I mentioned will spread wider rather than becoming super different. I do think it will change to some degree how a lot of the customer facing tasks work, right? So currently, a lot of financial professionals do basically, as I mentioned, interpret financial data for their clients. That interpretation task can actually be done very easily by large language models. And so moving some of those more customized, but also maybe less intellectually demanding tasks of just sort of interfacing between the client and the data, moving that to automated chatbots and giving everyone access to that both means that financial services become more democratized and that everyone gets access to them. But also it means that those financial professionals can either serve more clients or move on to more high value tasks around analysis. And so hopefully that means that a lot of the jobs in the financial services world become more interesting. People get more intellectually demanding tasks. And they can focus on the stuff that's actually fun, but they can also serve more people. And that, at least in the short run, might mean that the people who are really good at what they're doing can scale those abilities to serve a much larger population. In some sense, there might be a little bit of a superstar effect, where some of the people who are excellent can suddenly serve 1,000 customers, and the people who are not as good in that profession might have to go and either upskill or find a different value that they're adding, because just being a sort of warm body in the room is no longer enough, because the person who is much better at their job can just scale their own abilities to serve all of these people rather than requiring just someone who's mediocre to also be in the room with them.
Professor Gregor Schubert, thank you for sharing your invaluable insights on how generative AI is reshaping finance from research methodologies to corporate decision making. Your expertise in housing markets, labor economics, and financial innovation has provided a thought-provoking discussion on evolving role of AI in the industry. To our listeners, we hope this episode has provided you with a deeper understanding of the intersection between technology, economics, and decision making. Professor Schubert's work reminds us of the profound impact that innovation and research can have on the industries and society at large. Thank you once again, Professor Schubert, for your time and expertise. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. Until next time, this is Deepak signing off. Thank you so much, Professor Gregor Schubert.
Thank you so much, Deepak. This was great.